On this episode, uh, book review, Roswell Legacy. Author is Jesse Marcel Jr. He is the son of Jesse Marcel Sr., the senior intelligence officer at Roswell Army Airfield. The event that was to change his father's life and his happened one stormy evening, summer, at the Foster Ranch near Corona, New Mexico, about 75 miles northwest of Roswell. The foreman of that ranch, William McBrazel, heard a sound like that of how a bomb would sound in an explosion. The sound was apparently heard at another ranch about 10 to 12 miles away. Mr. Razzle stated that the noise was strong enough to rattle the windows of the ranch house for a short time. The thunderstorms in the area that night were pretty severe. This sound was different from anything produced by a thunderstorm or a lightning strike. McBrazel states, the following morning he saddled his horse and rode out to look for what could have possibly caused the loud explosion, and to check the area for any damage. To his surprise, he came across an area that was littered with, among other things, a huge amount of foil-like debris. Something had apparently impacted the ground at a high rate of speed and fanned its components into a wedge-shaped field of wreckage. A large herd of sheep was stranded on one side of the debris field. He stated, the sheep refused to cross it, even though their water supply was on the other side. Mr. Brazel ended up having to lead them all the way around the area so they could get to the water. Some reports say he gathered up some of the debris and brought it to a neighboring ranch where a woman named Loretta Proctor lived. She reportedly suggested to him that there might be some kind of reward for turning the material in. So a short time later, he went into the nearby town of Corona. It was there that he heard stories of strange flying machines invading the skies just recently. Although Mr. Brazel had previously seen debris from weather balloon crashes on the Foster Ranch, property, he stated this material looked different, very different, in fact. And after listening to the tales of the flying saucers, he became convinced that maybe the stuff that he had discovered was part of one of these strange machines. uh, Brazel thought the local sheriff's office would be the appropriate place to reveal what they had discovered. He left. He figured he let the Sheriff Wilcox take a look at it and decide what to do. The sheriffs apparently could not make a definitive judgment of what it was. So Sheriff Wilcox contacted the command of the Roswell Army Airfield. Colonel William Blanchard had Jesse Marcel Jr.'s dad go to the sheriff's office to see what Brazel had brought in. His father was the base intelligence officer, and as such, part of his job was to be on an investigative team for aircraft accidents or any problems that arose with security. His father looked the debris over and determined it was indeed bizarre. It was certainly out of the ordinary and merited further examination. Once Colonel Blanchard got his dad's report on the unusual nature of the material, he had his dad and Captain Sheridan Cavett, a counterintelligence agent, accompany Mr. Brazel back to the ranch so they could see for themselves what was there. They arrived early in the evening and decided to spend the night at the ranch and inspect the debris the next day. The following morning, the three of them went to see what was out there. The debris field was very large, and the debris field was wedge-shaped or fan-shaped. There was a scar at the apex of the fan, which spread out for several hundred yards to a considerable width at the end of the field. His dad collected some debris into a box and put it into the backseat of their 1942 Buick, and more in the trunk. Even with all of the material, he said that this was only a small portion of what was found. His father knew what he had found was something absolutely incredible, and had to share what he had seen with his mother and Jesse Marcel Jr. The debris ended up in the kitchen of their little house at 1300 West 7th Street, Roswell, New Mexico. It was a little after midnight when his dad came into his room to tell him to come out and see what he'd found. He said that he had been out to a ranch and had picked up debris from something that had crashed there. His dad was really excited that night, and he thought it was an extraordinary event. The first thing he noticed when reaching the kitchen was a cardboard box that had been mostly emptied, with the contents positioned carefully on the floor. Um, he told them that these parts were from a, quote, flying saucer, or words to that effect. Jesse Marcel Jr. looked wide-eyed at the material and determined that there were three different kinds of material present. Foil, broken pieces of plastic, and what appeared to be a kind of material, I-beams. The brownish black plastic looked similar to Bakelite, which was plastic used in countertops during the 1940s, or perhaps on a broken phonograph record. Actually, he states that the material was lighter than Bakelite, and whereas Bakelite was a fibrous material, this material had a more homogeneous structure to it. The pieces he saw were about 1/16 of an inch thick with fractured edges, yet he doesn't recall seeing any fractures in the material itself. The surface was smooth, with no wrinkles, grooves, or indentations. The largest piece was about 6 or 8 inches square, with most pieces being 3 or 4 inches. There was not nearly as much of this as there was of the foil. The I-beams, at first glance, appeared to be made from the same material as the foil, but they were more substantial. His dad asked his mom and him to look for any electronic components, such as vacuum tubes, resistors, condensers, or wire. After they searched through all of the materials, they all agreed there was nothing that appeared to be part of any electronic equipment, but I felt he already knew that and wanted them to confirm it. Jesse Marcel Jr. then focused his attention onto the foil, mainly because there was more of it than anything else. The foil was similar to the aluminum kitchen wrap of today, but appeared to be stronger, and it felt lighter than a feather in his hand. Although it looked like kitchen foil at first glance, it was more substantial and seemed to be less malleable. As he picked it up, he noticed it did not have a paper backing for rigidity, as would the foil of a radar target, which was what others later said it was. The edges of the foil-like substance was irregular, with sharp tears covering the entire perimeter of the pieces. Even though the boy was curious to bend it or tear it, he did not. His father later examined the materials back at the base and mentioned that when he bent or folded a piece of the foil, it would return to its original shape when released. There were larger pieces of the foil that he did not see, and these larger pieces were nearly indestructible. His dad described how one of the men from his office took a sledgehammer and hit one of the large pieces, but could not make a dent in it or deform it in any way. The sledgehammer simply bounced off the piece. The foil had a more or less dull appearance, similar to a burnished aluminum surface, not shiny or highly reflective, although one side may have been more polished than the other. The surface of the foil itself was somewhat smooth. The pieces didn't have any distinct sign or shape. They were amorphous. He remembers looking at the foil material for quite a while. In particular, he remembers how light it was. If you dropped it, it would float like a feather, to the ground. Him and his dad tried to fit them together like a jigsaw puzzle. They got on their hands and knees and tried to fit the pieces together, but could find no two pieces that would interlock. They couldn't make any kind of outline that would make sense. And as there were simply too many pieces of the puzzle to fit any of them together, they finally gave up. Again, to make things clear, him and his mother looked for anything that could be associated with electronics, such as vacuum tubes, condensers, resistors, or wire. What he really wanted them to do was to look for pieces of a radio. He plowed through the debris, but could not find anything related to a radio. Not even anything that resembled staples, rivets, fasteners, and so on. There were no electronic components whatsoever in the debris they saw or in any of the other material recovered from the site. His dad was well apprised of what was in the debris, and there was no mention of electronic components by anyone or in any of the released photos of the debris. Jesse Marcel Jr. then saw what looked like a metallic beam sticking out of the box. There were several of these beams in the box, with the longer being about 18 inches and the shortest about 12 inches. He picked the larger beam out of the box and took a long look at it, holding it over his head to get a better perspective of it in the ceiling light. The material looked similar to a kite stick, except it was made of metal. It somewhat resembled an I-beam used in building construction. It was only 3/8 of an inch wide and was a dull gray metallic color. The beam's central portion was about 1/16 of an inch tall, with the shoulders of the I-beam forming a ridge along its length. He figured this was something that added structural rigidity to whatever it came from. The material itself seemed to be identical to the foil, just in a structural form. It was also incredibly light for its size. Here comes the exciting part. He notices something unusual about the inside surface of the I-beam. He caught a glint of color on the inner surface, kind of like a purplish violet hue with a metallic tinge. This surface was somewhat shiny and reflective when light was shone directly on it. As he looked at the piece with the light reflecting on the inner surface, he could see what looked like writing. At first, he thinks of Egyptian hieroglyphics, but there were no animal outlines or figures. They weren't mathematical figures either. They were more like geometric symbols, squares, circles, triangles, pyramids, and the like. Approximately 1/4 of an inch tall, they were imprinted on the inner surface of the beam, and only on one side. They were not engraved into the I-beam, but seemed more like part of its surface. There were about 30 symbols, one right after another. These figures were solid. They were not line drawings. I don't recall what all of the symbols looked like, or whether or not they repeated themselves. He does distinctly remember a few of them. However, one reminded him of a seal balancing a ball on its nose. That symbol was like a truncated pyramid with a solid ball over the apex. Sort of like the pyramid with an eye over it on the back of the dollar bill. He recalls this symbol being located more toward one end of the beam. The symbol located just to the right of this was an oblate spheroid. The spheroid sometimes would appear with two smaller spheroids below the larger spheroid, and sometimes above, sort of like a hologram image appears and then disappears as you move it at different angles with your hand. The next symbol had the same configuration, except it was reversed 90 degrees. To the right of these symbols was a simple oval, with the largest area of the oval being through the center section. Most of the individual symbols were about the same height and width. The symbols themselves were very close together, almost touching, but not quite. He called the findings to the attention of his folks showing his mother first because his father was standing off to one side. They passed the I-beam back and forth between the two of them. At this point, he was getting a little excited, wondering what the symbols might represent. They seemed strange indeed. His dad was quite interested in the I-beam, and felt that the symbols might represent an alphabet of some sort. For him, this was the centerpiece of the whole experience. There was one other type of debris, though, that he didn't see in the material his dad brought home, but he said it was in some of the other debris. Many years later, he told his wife, Linda, that there were fine strands resembling fishing line in some of the material. These could have very possibly been a type of fiber optic. He recalls that Bill Brazel, Mac Brazel's son, also described what was shown on one end, light. It was transmitted to the other end, similar to a fiber optic cable. After they had looked at the debris for about 15 or 20 minutes, they placed the material back in the cardboard box it came in, and he accompanied his dad outside as he put the box into the back seat of their car. His mother and Jesse Marcel Jr. then returned to their bedrooms as his dad took off to the base. With the precious cargo. As he's noted before, his dad had shown his mother and him only a small portion of the debris that was collected on the Foster Ranch. And there was much more investigation to be done. After the debris was taken to the base, Colonel Blanchard had a look at it and ordered the material to be flown to Fort Worth, Texas. So General Ramey, the 8th Air Force commander, could inspect it. It was flown in a B-29 under armed guard. The plane had to fly at low altitudes because the guards were in the unpressurized cargo compartment. With the debris. His dad was also on that flight, and it was he who displayed the debris to General Ramey in his office. Ramey had him point out on a map the exact location where the debris was collected. He then ordered it to be flown to Wright-Patterson Army Airfield in Dayton, Ohio. His dad confirmed that this material was from an unearthly craft. And he was certainly convinced of this himself, Jesse Marcel Jr. His father had gone to radar and intelligence school, so he was pretty well versed in the types of radar targets of that day. This debris was not from anything he had ever seen. But there was more to it than that. It seems that he had seen other things that convinced him that this was not of human manufacture. Jesse Marcel Jr. trusted his father's expertise, and it didn't take much to convince himself that he was correct. Check this fact out. As far as the volume of the debris, just to give you an idea, they had to use a C-54 Skymaster, which is a large cargo aircraft, to transport it all. The pilot of the aircraft was a Captain Henderson, who apparently saw far more than just the debris from the impact site. Based on some of the interviews with his family, he may in fact have seen the remains of the crew. Jesse Marcel Jr. never forgot that night in his kitchen. How could the 11-year-old boy then not be excited? He has never really been a fan of science fiction, but this was not fiction. For him, this was a science reality, and it was a far more exciting reality than any of the science he had learned in school. It was an event that definitely changed him. From that evening on, his life took on a different meaning. He could never look at the night sky the same way again, because for all he knew, someone else might be looking back.